Welcome back, everybody, to episode number 16 of the Untangling Election 2021 podcast, your semi-weekly podcast covering the now former Canadian election of 2021. So last night was election night, and we've had about a day to digest results, which were all in all very similar to 2019. Given this, we want to reflect a bit on election 2021 and the results. What happened? What did we think of it? Who really won? And who really lost? So joining me today, because it's our season finale in some senses, not that I'm going to stop doing episodes after this, but I'm joined by three of my friends today, Sav, Drake, and Kevin, and they're all going to provide some expert insights of what we all looked at last night. So I'll ask each of you to briefly introduce yourselves and your biases, and then we'll get into the meat of this topic. Kevin, want to start us off?
Hi, guys. I'm Kevin. I've been on this podcast quite a bit now. I believe it's my 6th episode. I am an accounting graduate from the University of Waterloo. I was a former Young Liberal for the Universities Association, but this election, I actually voted Conservative. So that's a bit about me.
Interesting. And I'll bother you from now on if your vote actually did count or did matter.
All right.
But yes. Sav, what about you? Introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Sav. I'm a fourth-year political science student at the University of Waterloo, specializing in Canadian politics and minoring in gender and social justice. I'm also a volunteer for Anime Paul's campaign in Toronto Centre, and I voted Liberal this time around.
Ooh.
Controversial.
Yes. Well, I mean, having volunteered for Anime Paul, I will get into this later, but she thanked you pretty profusely, or not you personally, but the volunteers.
I felt it personally. I did. I definitely did.
Aw.
The only reason I really focused on that is because I was so expecting a resignation speech there. But anyways, moving on. Drake, introduce yourself. Who are you?
Certainly. I'm Drake, and I'm a 23-year-old software developer, a graduate of the University of Waterloo. I tend to skew left of center. Simon parades me as his former Green Party member friend, and I voted Liberal as well in this election.
So if a good blend of spectrums, and myself, of course, I'm Simon. I'm a 24-year-old graduate of the University of Waterloo, and I also have a Master's of International Relations from the Netherlands. I love Canadian politics. However, I'm a bit overly invested for somebody who can't vote in this election simply because I don't have my citizenship yet. So hopefully I'll have that by the time the next election rolls around and I can make a better difference. But, it's been interesting to follow it nonetheless. So this election was interesting this election night. I want to start us off today, and then we'll get into more of the meat of the exact results. But I just want to ask you guys how you experienced election night. What were your impressions? What were the highlights, the lowlights?
Going to this election, I was not really too excited about it. I was very disappointed by the campaign. I thought the campaign itself was extremely negative, and there was a huge lack of ideas from all the parties, in my opinion, for a huge majority of the campaign. However, once election night started, I started getting a bit excited. Like the good old graphics came back up on the CBC, like the ribbons with like the vote tallies and the totals came up, and early results were were somewhat unexpected. As the night wore on, it kind of got more and more into expected territory, and so the enthusiasm kind of waned. But this election night did remind me of why I enjoy following politics so much.
Yeah, you enjoyed the hecticness, the frenzy,
Yes.
Drake, did you have any thoughts as well? What did you love about election 2021?
Yeah, well, we knew going into it that it was going to be a very tight election. And indeed, at the start, when the Maritime polls closed, it looked like it was going to be a lot tighter than it ended up being once the rest of the country started reporting its results. In terms of what I enjoyed, I mean, I thought most of the leaders had very good speeches in the wee hours of the morning. And then, of course, it's just always fun to just kind of watch the results come in and find a few seats to just watch and go like, oh, are they going to do it? Are they going to do it? And then, eventually you find out. Or some seats still haven't been called because it's just too tight. So the excitement lives on.
Well, that's a good point, Drake. I know myself personally, having been a lot more invested doing this podcast, I really knew what ridings to look out for, and that really added to the viewing experience, just, having an eye on things like that. Sav, being even more invested than myself, arguably volunteering for a campaign, what were your takeaways from election 2021?
Yeah, really good question. So I had the privilege of actually hosting the viewing party that the UW Political Science Students Association hosted. We went till about 1:45 a.m. I don't think that's as long as you guys went, but yeah, and it was a great experience overall just watching the votes come in. Obviously, I'm very disappointed. I'm not even disappointed. I'm embarrassed by Anime Paul's performance in Toronto Center. It was I was baffled by the Conservative candidate coming in third and Anime Paul coming in fourth, just in front of the PPC. But overall, it was really interesting, as Drake was saying, that when the maritime provinces came in, that it seemed like the Conservatives might have performed better than what they did, because all they really achieved is the exact same thing in 2019. But what I was surprised at was that the Bloc actually picked up a couple more seats. And so if I had to say, maybe if there was a winner today, maybe in fact it was the Bloc.
Honestly, I was leaning that way too when I was like preparing for this episode, because I was surprised when I saw they made gains, because everybody back in 2019 said they overperformed. But before we get into the minutia, I want to read out the results that we have right now, and then we can spend another half hour, 2 hours talking about it. I'm hoping not 2 hours. That last episode was hell to edit. But regardless, Drake is laughing guiltily, if you might have heard. But yeah, I'm going to quickly run through the results, as well as tell you guys how much they gained from 2019, which might be important if you haven't checked this out before. So the Liberals won 32% of the popular vote and have a projected finish of 158 seats, which is a +1 gain of 2019. The Conservatives got 34% of the popular vote, are projected to finish with 119 seats, which is a -2 loss from 2019. The Bloc Quebecois got 7.8% of the popular vote. They are projected to finish with 34 seats, which is a +2 gain from 2019. The NDP got 17% of the popular vote. They are projected to finish with 25 seats, which is a +1 gain from 2019. The Green Party got 23% of the 2.3% of the vote. Sorry about that.
Definitely not 22.
Yes, I was almost baffled by my own notes, but it's my terrible handwriting. But regardless, they finished with 2 seats, which is a loss of 1 from 2019. And the PPC finished with 0 seats, which is a 0 gain, I guess, and 5% of the popular vote. So, given these results, what really stood out to us?
What really stood out to me was, the lack of movement, to be honest. Like, usually in elections, you usually see parties gain or lose more than 10 seats, but this election, no party gained or lost significant ground at all, which I believe is very, very rare in Canadian politics. I don't think it's really ever happened before. So for me, that was by far the most noteworthy thing. And that really brings into question why Trudeau even called this election in the first place if public perception hasn't shifted significantly. And in the end, we spent $600 million on coming back to the same place we were before.
I guess just to quickly poll all of us, given that we now know the results, would we have called election if we were the Liberals?
Absolutely not.
No. It's made Trudeau's position much harder.
Yeah.
No, I don't think that I would have.
So do you think that the Liberals' gain of 1 seat is something significant? I think 2 of us here voted Liberal, so you have some explaining to do.
To be fair, I voted Liberal in a riding that has gone Liberal since 1933. So, I stand behind my vote, but also it didn't make a lick of difference.
Well, mine was a little bit more of a contentious riding, and so we actually did have a Conservative incumbent who was elected as a Liberal in 2015 but crossed the floor. So I voted Liberal, and the Liberal candidate won in my riding by, I think, only there's one more polling station that needs to come in, but right now she has a lead just over 1,000 votes, so it's looking pretty likely. But it's in the 905 region as well. I think that that's a big indicator too, that the Conservatives didn't really reach the 905 region as much as they wanted, even though in Kevin's riding, the Conservative won against the incumbent Liberal, which is also in the 905 region.
Yes, I think it's definitely interesting that despite the fact that every party is basically coming back to where they were in 2019, plus or minus 2 seats, there have been some shifts. The Conservatives picked up 2 seats in the Maritimes, but that was offset by the Liberals really performing strong in Ontario. And I mean, the Liberals are coming back with 1, possibly even 2 seats in Alberta. I mean, those people probably feel as if they're about to become cabinet ministers so that Trudeau can have some prairie representation in his cabinet once more.
So yeah, it's been a weird campaign from the Liberals. Then I guess technically they pulled off a victory in some sense. I'm gonna pause on that saying whether they won or not because I want to leave that till the end. But I also want to shift a bit to the Conservatives because, in my opinion, losing 2 seats from when they were polling above the Liberals for a consistent amount of this campaign seems pretty embarrassing. Any reactions to how they performed last night?
Well, I wouldn't know to say embarrassing because yes, the Conservatives were leading for by a pretty large amount, I think, during the first and second weeks of the campaign. But before the writs were dropped, the Liberals were the ones with a huge lead, and it looked like the Liberals would just saunter their way to the easy majority. So if you maybe kind of ignore the huge movement during the campaign, you could argue that the Conservatives had a successful campaign in containing the Liberals and keeping them to a minority. Although I don't really think they would think like that, but to a neutral observer, that could be an interpretation of how the results went.
I think to kind of piggyback off of Kevin's point, I think that's definitely how Aaron O'Toole was trying to spin it during his speech. But what I found interesting is that, yes, Conservatives again won the popular vote, which doesn't really mean much in our first past the post system. But I think it's really interesting because you see that Aaron O'Toole really didn't make a difference and potentially lost 2 more seats than Andrew Scheer did and didn't gain any ground, but the tone is so different from their final speeches. So it's clear that Aaron O'Toole wants to hold on to his position as leader and give it another go, but we'll see where that goes.
For sure. I went back and I watched part of Andrew Scheer's speech on election night 2019 just because I wanted to make sure I wasn't misremembering it. And he did come off a lot more combative, digging his heels in. I'm going like, you can't get rid of me. I'm going to stick it out. Aaron O'Toole seems to be projecting at least a little bit more confidence that he thinks the party will keep him on for another election. And I mean, personally, I think that would be the best for the party. I know Kevin has his views on whether the party is going to slingshot to the right after this.
Well, I agree with Drake, actually. I hope that Aaron O'Toole stays on. I think in the long-term future of the Conservative Party, it's best that he stays on. I think it's very obvious that the Conservative Party needs to appeal to, well, I guess more people in the center, because the only way the Conservatives can win, judging from this election, is by picking up more seats around the GTA suburbs. That's pretty much the only way they can really make up the gap of the 50 or so seats they need to get a majority, because they've kind of tapped out their support elsewhere. They're not going to win. Well, they might win like a couple more seats in the prairies, but that's not really going to be a huge gain. And in Quebec doesn't really seem like a very fertile ground for the Conservatives. So it's mainly the GTA and also the Maritimes, I believe, where the Conservatives are going to have to really look for more seats. And in the Conservatives in those areas are more of the red Tory lean than the more populist lean of the prairies. And it's going to be very hard for the Conservative Party to balance those two bases, and it's going to be very interesting to see how they do that.
For sure. They needed to crack the 905 in this election. And I mean, you could say they made 2 gains with the riding of Thornhill and King Vaughan riding. And, they flipped those 2 to the Conservatives, but not near enough to make a difference. I don't remember the exact figures, but it's something like the popular vote in Ontario was about 5 points for the Liberals to the Conservatives, and yet the Liberals won more than double the seats of the Conservatives in Ontario. So if you want to form government, you got to get those juicy GTA seats, and Aaron O'Toole couldn't crack in.
Yeah, which is, I guess, surprising too, given how much we've all focused on his platform being much more, I guess, centrist-leaning than we've seen in so many other conservative platforms. So it'll be interesting to see where this party goes from here. I also want to touch a bit on the Bloc Quebecois, and then maybe the Greens later. But the Bloc Quebecois, you mentioned earlier, Sav, that you were surprised at how they performed. I share your surprise. Do you want to dig into that a little more?
Yeah, I don't know the specific ridings, but I know there was a couple of shifts in, I believe it was Liberal strongholds in Quebec that went to the Bloc, which ended up with Yves Francois Blanchet gaining 2 more seats than he did last time. And I think that this is really interesting because do we pinpoint to the debate in the English debate where the moderator posed the question about discriminatory laws in a way that favored Blanchet and made him really heighten these so-called ideological differences between Quebec and the rest of Canada? By the way, I'm not a Quebecer, so I also definitely acknowledge that I have a bit of a gap in my knowledge as it pertains to Quebec. But is it that, or are we actually seeing the shift that Quebecers are really fundamentally, since the resurgence of the Bloc in 2019, are they really of this ideology? And it's going to be very interesting to see where this will lead in the future. But Blanchet did a great job, apparently.
Yeah. It is worth noting that so they've elected 32 Bloc. There's 2 ridings yet to be called that the Bloc are leading in. One, they lead the Conservatives by 33 votes, and in another, they lead the Liberals by 147 votes. And those are still too close to call. Not all the votes have been counted, so they may actually finish this election at 32 seats and not have gained any. But I think we can say fairly conclusively that English debate question really did light a fire under the Bloc and remind Quebecers and really unite Quebecers behind the Bloc as this party that above all stands for Quebec and what Quebec wants. Because beforehand, Blanchet had been looking for a wedge between him and the other parties to really show that no other party can be trusted to stand up for the Quebec values. And it really, to me, that moderator handed Blanchet that wedge issue on a silver platter. 10 days left in the election.
It is the Bloc played a very interesting role in this election. I actually think the Bloc may have played the most interesting role in this election because I feel like the Bloc was the reason why Justin Trudeau's Liberals actually didn't get a majority. Justin Trudeau's Liberals finished 12 or 13 seats short of a majority, and at the beginning of the campaign, it looked like Blanchet's Bloc Quebecois were not going to do as well in Quebec as they did last election, with the difference mostly benefiting the Liberals. And so if the Liberals could have managed to pick up another 10 or so seats in Quebec, they probably would have won a majority. So in a way, I agree with Sav and Drake here. I think that it was the English debate. I think it was the rather poorly worded question, in my opinion, from the English moderator Shachi Curl, that really had all the wagons of Quebec circle around the Bloc Quebecois because they felt like their culture was being attacked, and that kind of denied the Liberals a majority. Yeah, they played a pretty interesting role, and I do think that in the future, I think the campaigns really need to focus on how to assuage Quebec voters.
Yeah, we've always noted, the Quebec vote determines how these elections go. The major upsets we've seen within Canadian electoral history, especially within the last decade or two, have all been Quebec related, basically. Especially look at the Orange Wave of Jack Layton. That was basically on the strength of his performance in Quebec. So it'll be interesting how this turns out, because I remember in 2019, during my classes on Canadian politics and everything, all the professors were saying the Bloc Quebecois overperformed in 2019. They are not going to finish with 32 seats again. And lo and behold, they finished at 34. So,
well, they have 32. They don't have 34 yet. I'm going to keep bringing that up.
By the time this is posted, Drake, I will make sure it is 34. I will personally commit electoral fraud.
You're going to roll up with one last ballot box and be like, wait. I've had some more ballots.
Ontario votes have come.
Just a quick note before we go off of the Bloc. What I find really interesting is that I thought during the French debate that Trudeau defended the Liberals quite well as it pertains to being a Quebecer and to really giving it to Blanchet. But the actions of what happened in the English debate have really apparently set the tone for what happened in this past election. Just a point that I thought I'd point out there.
For sure. And I mean,
it's a really good point.
In the aftermath, in the post-media scrum, Blanchet was like, and none of the other leaders even said anything about how, just racist that question was and anti-Quebec that question was. And then sheepishly, I would say, O'Toole and Trudeau released statements like the next 2 days being like, yes, that question was unfair. Probably because they realized.
So did the NDP
too. They did?
It was.
Okay.
Yeah.
Which Jagmeet Singh kowtowing to Quebec voters, I will never understand.
Well, he maybe wants to replicate the orange wave again, although I don't see that happening, unfortunately.
I mean, on the topic of the NDP performance, midway through last night, well, at around 2 a.m., I randomly in our call said, the NDP really lost this, didn't they? They really underperformed, in my opinion. Because as we're looking at this, right now, they've only gained 1 seat from 24 seats, which everybody in 2019 said was a massive underperformance. So, what do we think of the results here? Do we think that the NDP could have done better? Are they disappointed by this result, despite grabbing 70% of the popular vote?
They definitely did disappoint. I think one of the biggest issues that the NDP has, and what we just alluded to there, is that they don't have enough regional focus to be a mainstay in the party itself. I believe if they focused on a province like BC in particular and really built a base that they could grow and just constantly rely on, it would make all the difference in the world. And then they could go after getting some of those seats that Jack Layton's Orange Wave picked up in Ontario and Quebec. But again, I don't know. We all just said too, right, that as long as Jagmeet Singh's leader, I don't want to speak for everybody, but I don't think that he will pick up seats in Quebec. So what happens from here with the NDP, I think Jagmeet stays on as leader, but I don't know what their role is in this government, other than being the ones that will actually make the Liberals pass more progressive legislation.
Yeah, because it's important to note too, for anybody listening in, the third place party is not the NDP in Parliament. It's the Bloc Quebecois by quite a margin now. So, yeah, popular vote-wise, the NDP for sure are, but actual seat-wise, they're not.
I predicted at the very start of this election that the NDP would actually do worse than they did last election. I was wrong, but not by much. The NDP barely did any better. I don't think you could say a net gain of 1 seat is that significant of an improvement. And did they gain or lose in the popular vote? I think they kind of stayed around the same, right? Or
the NDP had 17.7% of the popular vote.
Yeah,
and 15.9% last time.
Okay, so they did make a small gain in the popular vote, but you can't. But I feel like everyone
Kevin, that's a Green Party level of gain there.
They literally gained one 2021 year election Green Party's worth of support over last time.
We could banter the Green Party on their own time.
Oh, we will do that in a minute.
I mean, we noticed, or at least it was reported, and just listening to Jagmeet speak in the weekend leading into the campaign, there seemed to be a shift in his rhetoric more towards the idea that the NDP was going to go back to their role as what they like to call themselves as like the conscience of the House of Commons. We're not in power, but we're going to push the other parties to do better, to be better, and pass progressive policies. And it was a very subtle shift, and he wasn't conceding there, but it did seem to be a slight acknowledgement that the polls were not reflecting the growth they were hoping to see.
I think part of it may be that strategic voting did come into play in the end. I feel like this is always like the perennial thorn in the side of the NDP. Like during the campaign, the NDP actually goes up a bit in the polls and everyone gets excited. But then comes election time, and the only poll that matters, the NDP kind of underperforms, and that's because people, especially left of center voters, in a close election such as this one, get cold feet at the ballot box, and they decide to throw their lot in with the Liberals because the Liberals could actually potentially win and to keep the Conservatives out. And I believe this is what happened this election. This election was very close, and I think that a lot of NDP supporters, they didn't want the Conservatives to win more than they wanted to vote for the NDP. And I know this because in 2015, I was considering voting for the NDP, and I got cold feet, and I voted for the Liberals at the last moment too. So I kind of have firsthand experience of this. I think another problem with the NDP, in addition to Sav's great point about not really having a base in any of the provinces, I feel like their voter base in general is not as reliable as other parties. They're mostly focused on younger voters. That was their campaign. Jagmeet Singh is very big on TikTok. He had a Twitch stream a couple of days back. He was definitely trying to win that young vote, and that's great and all. But in an election, the young vote is the vote that has by far the most turnout issues out of all the demographics. We see this in the U.S. with Bernie Sanders. In the 2020 Democratic primary, Bernie Sanders relied on the young vote, and the young vote kind of let him down. And we'll see this with the NDP. In my opinion, in order to become a truly national party that can actually have the potential to win an election, the NDP needs to grow beyond a young base. And in order to do that, they need to kind of change their image a bit.
But on the other hand, young voters do grow old. That's how humans work.
Yeah, but when they grow old, they vote conservative.
Yeah. Well, let's move on to some other change. And I want to do the PPC first and then do the green one. Leave the one we're going to, I guess, have some fun opinions about.
The least popular vote.
Yeah, we'll do by vote count.
Yeah, you are going by vote count, aren't you?
Yeah. But anyways, PPC. What do we think? Because I know, Kevin, you've been pretty wrong about your bold prediction to win more than one seat. So,
thank God for
if
that.
anything else, you're not. Yes.
All right. Well, I mean, the PPC kind of suffered like a bit of a mini NDP syndrome, as I like to call it. I think
Wow.
a lot of people they underperformed in the polls as well, and I think that might be because some PPC voters, they hate Trudeau and they wanted to get him out more than they wanted to vote PPC. Which I guess shows everyone that PPC voters actually do have some rational thought in their heads. No, I'm joking.
I'm afraid I'm going to have to push back on the fact that they underperformed the polls, though. They got 5.1% of the popular vote. That's square right where they were being put in terms of the projections.
Depends which projection.
If you're looking at individual polls, if you look at the bands of support that the aggregates were giving, it was like 4 to 8%. 5 fits in that band quite comfortably.
I would, kind of going off of Drake's point there, I actually think that the PPC did exactly what they wanted to do. And I think it was evident in the fact that Bernier knew that he wasn't even going to win his seat. He was in Saskatoon for his speech party, his speech after the election with his party. And I think it's what we're seeing is really evident is that Bernier is trying to grow the party. He's trying to have support, particularly out west, and building from there, which is interesting because I don't know why he didn't decide to run out there if that was his whole plan. But I do think it was telling that he was there for the election results. And I do think that it is quite alarming to me, but surprising of how well they actually did do. And if this is a trend that's going to continue, I think that Bernier is also benefiting off of a lot of anti-vax, anti-mask, anti-COVID kind of rhetoric right now, and we'll see if that kind of holds over the next few years. But if it does, the PPC could be one of those interesting swing type of parties in Canadian politics for at least a little bit of time.
The question is can they maintain their momentum once COVID is done and over and you no longer have vaccines and public health restrictions as part of everyday life? And I think, Aaron O'Toole is hoping and praying that they can't, because there are seats that we can conclusively say, I would say, would have been won by a Conservative had the People's Party not been there. Obviously, we can't just say, oh, well, all the People's Party voters would have voted Conservative. There's a quite significant amount of PPC voters who were first-time voters and came out. But there are a couple ridings, particularly one that a Liberal picked up in Alberta, where the Liberal beat the Conservative by a threshold of 400 votes, and the PPC candidate took several thousand. And so that's kind of a case where I'm sure the Conservatives are looking at that riding and being like, we feel quite concretely that the PPC spoiled that for us.
Bernier is having his late revenge.
Yeah, he is. I think the biggest election takeaway for the PPC is that they're kind of legitimized as a serious political party in Canada.
My prediction
now.
comes true.
Yeah, that's true. Your prediction did come true. We all remember in 2019, the People's Party was seen as kind of a joke. They only won like 1% of the vote. And I mean, in my opinion, as soon as you win more than like 5% of the vote, you're definitely considered a party, a serious political party in the Canadian political landscape. And that brings with it a lot of advantages, such as, more media attention and a debate presence. I believe that with the new debate rules, I think the PPC will qualify for the debates to the next election, which
it depends on what they set the rules at, because these rules were kind of arbitrarily determined.
That is true.
By a nonpartisan body, though.
Yes, but they said 4.1% being the cutoff out of just looking at polls.
Well, I mean, they got 5% this time. So.
Yes, I think if they are excluded again next year, it would be I don't think it'll happen.
It would be a very bad look on Canadian democracy, in my opinion. I think they should be at the debates. I honestly think they should have been at the debates this time. Although, to be fair, they didn't really qualify for the criteria that everyone set out. So I can't really complain too much about that. But it's very, very interesting to see where they'll go. I think their relevance in the future might depend more on the Conservatives. If the Conservatives turn back into a more populist route, then maybe they'll struggle a bit to find their own niche. But if the Conservatives stick with O'Toole and stick towards the center, they might find more success with disaffected far-right Conservative voters, in my opinion.
Well, I guess turning now to the worst performing major political party, the Greens. I know, considering Drake is a former Green Party member, a paying one, might I add.
Former paying one, let's be clear.
And Sav herself volunteered for Enemy Paul's campaign. I'm expecting to beat her some nice flaming opinions here.
You know, I'll kick it off with a question. I said it last night because I was sitting in a call with Simon and Kevin, but it was late, so maybe they don't remember. The Greens, as it stands right now, have 373,000 votes. And would anybody on this call like to guess how many elections you have to go back for them to have performed worse than they performed in this election?
30 years.
Well, they haven't been around quite that long. It's the 2000. Oh, I should have waited. But it's the 2000 election when they took 100,000 votes, and every election after that they've had at least 500,000. Of course, and then of course they peaked in 2019. So this election is just an absolute collapse of the Green vote.
373,000.
That's it.
That's what you said. Wow, that's a bigger collapse than I thought. In 2019, they won 1.1 million votes, so they've lost almost around 2/3 of their votes. Mm-hmm. Really?
Yep. And I think the only reason they gained or even got 2 seats is because of the Liberal collapse in Kitchener Centre.
Yeah, I was just going to talk about that. We had talked earlier about external forces influencing a particular seat. It was actually Ashley Burke of the CBC who broke the story about Raj Saini's sexual misconduct allegations that eventually caused him to withdraw from the race around Labor Day. And that really created an opening. Mike Morris, who I've met, and full disclosure, when I was a Green Party member, I did vote in his nomination competition to be the candidate in 2019. He took them to second place from 6 to 26% of the vote in 2019, but had Raj Saini still been in the race, I don't think we'd be looking at it. The Greens would have been cut back down to Elizabeth May. Paul Manley lost his seat. His seat hasn't been called because it's so close between the NDP and the Conservative, but he's several thousand votes behind. He's not going to come up from behind and take that seat. So, again, an external force saved the Greens from only going down to 2 seats instead of 1.
Sav, I know you campaigned for one of these seats that was not successful.
Yes.
How do you feel about your last few months of time?
Good question. Just to kind of agree with what Drake was saying there, I think that, it's unfortunate to see what has happened. I'm so glad that Mike Morris got a seat. I do think that the argument, though, that people have that it's it's more the candidate more than the party itself. I think it is a mixture of both, but I think for all Green Party members, you really bank on the candidate. We really banked on Elizabeth May, and that's how she eventually got into power. It was not an easy road for Elizabeth May to get into power. And you bank on Mike Morris, and he's a guy in the community who's worked for years getting to where he was. So, yes, it is the candidate. I do think the party also plays into it, but there's just a lot of hard work that has been done by these 2 respective now members of parliament that I don't want to take away from. But I do agree that the Liberals, had the Liberals been in the election, it would have been not a great day for Mike Morris. In terms of Enemy Paul's campaign, which I find very interesting, so currently I think there are a couple more polls left in Toronto Centre, but they've already called it for Marcy Ian, who has a ridiculous lead on the NDP who came in second. Enemy Paul came in 4th in her riding with 3,600 votes approximately.
9%.
9%.
Wow.
She in 2019 had 3,800 votes when she was a nobody running in that riding when Bill Morneau was still around. It is disturbing to see how she went from 3,800 votes to 8,200 votes, with a difference in a by-election, mind you, so lower voter turnout, to back down to 3,600 for now votes. It's as the leader of the Green Party.
Who
and
had
if that's
media
not
exposure every day, basically.
Every day.
She did press conferences every day. She was constantly on CTV News. Anybody that was willing to interview her, she went and she did. And she worked hard. There's no doubt about it. But I think this is indicative of the end of the Annamie Paul reign. And I know Drake mentioned too in the podcast, and I've heard too, that I think it's usually 6 months after the election, there's a leadership review. I imagine that Annamie Paul will resign before then, but we never know what could happen. But overall, very disappointing for the Greens in Toronto Centre. Sorry, I was
stunned. Honestly, I was stunned that Annamie Paul did not resign on election night. I feel like a result like that for the leader of a federal party who, I mean, prospectively would want to get into government in some capacity, that's like unacceptable. Like, I don't understand how she could finish fourth in a riding where, again, as Simon said, she had constant media exposure. She pretty much spent most of her time in that
20
riding.
Full days.
Most of the campaign. She didn't really contribute to a lot of other Green candidates' campaigns. Did she even campaign in Kitchener Centre?
She went to Kitchener Centre the same day Jagmeet Singh was there.
Oh, really? Well, there's that. But it didn't seem like she helped out in a lot of other Green Party ridings. She definitely did not really campaign nationally, which Elizabeth May did.
She, in all fairness, she spent like a day in BC and she spent like a day in PEI.
Wow, a day in BC
and a day in Kitchener Centre.
You gotta realize that those carbon outputs of flights, that's unacceptable.
Well, that's the thing, though. She wasn't flying. Well, I mean, I think she flew to BC, but historically, the Greens have used VIA to get around. That's how Elizabeth May would like tour the countries. They actually got in trouble because they were holding campaign events at VIA rail stations and they didn't get permission. It'd be like, Elizabeth May's getting off the train.
Honestly, the Greens, I do think need a new leader, but it'll be very interesting to see how that new leader would take the Greens. Because if I'm correct, that Annamie Paul was pretty much a compromise candidate, right? She was the more moderate candidate compared to Dimitri Lascaris, who was like the kind of like an eco-socialist faction in the Green Party. And it'd be interesting if the Green Party goes into a more left-wing route now or stays towards the center. I personally feel like they would have greater electoral success sticking towards the center. But then again, I say that about every party. So it'd be interesting to hear an actual insider's thoughts, Sav.
Yeah, it's interesting because I don't know. I look at the States a lot, and I'm a big, big fan of AOC, and I love progressive politics. So a part of me is like, Annamie Paul really wasn't that. So if you do switch it up, you might as well kind of go and see what happens. But what I would say is that after this whole debacle of the Green Party and the infighting and the alleged racism and anti-Semitism that exists in the party, what progressive candidate would want to run for a party like that? Is there trust in the party with party members, let alone the public? So I don't know. I don't know what direction that they go in.
I think part of what really hindered the Greens, and they're going to have to rebuild from, is that they took a massive hit to their credibility going into this election with the internal strife. And then you have Annamie Paul during the election, where she admits that she's not going to visit every riding, even if it's competitive, because she's concerned that she may not be wanted or she could hurt the local candidate's chance. She also talked about how she thought of quitting and the fact that they were in an election and she thought, it would be wrong of me to leave the party leaderless during a campaign. That's not exactly inspiring if the leader's like, I'm really here because of this election and I've already been thinking about quitting and I'm still on the fence. And then, the Greens were the last one to release their platform. They released a partial costing of their platform the day before the election on Sunday. And for the first time in, I think, 4 elections, they did not have a candidate in every riding. They only ran 255 candidates. And that's something Elizabeth May actually spoke about and said she was quite disappointed and wanted an investigation as to what happened there. Because there were some candidates who wanted to run for the Greens, but they were not, like, paperwork wasn't done, something happened, and they were not given the green light to run as a Green. They weren't given the green light, pardon my pun. So
I noticed.
I didn't until I did. So the Greens, whoever comes in after Amy Paul, because I do think not winning her seat and losing that badly, the Greens are a forgiving party, but that performance in Toronto Centre is too poor to give Amy Paul another chance at another election, given all the other drama going on. So it's really time for the Greens to sit down, do some soul searching, and figure out how they're going to rebuild their credibility and reemerge as a competitive national party in the regions where they are competitive.
I think that's a good way to leave it on. But talking about soul searching, I think us as the Canadian populace should do some soul searching as well, because we have the early turnout numbers in front of us. And apparently, this election had a turnout of 58.9%, which is horrifically low for any modern democracy. To give you some context, in 2019, turnout was 67%, almost 10 points higher. In 2015, it was 68%, and in 2011, it was 61%. So I don't want to spend too long talking about these turnout numbers, but what are you guys' thoughts on this?
I mean, it's an election that nobody wanted in the middle of the fourth wave. The election call happened, and we were talking about how we might be entering a fourth wave, and we're definitely in it. And so it does not surprise me, given all of that people stayed home.
I do think that the turnout, I don't know. I feel like usually in low turnout elections, the right of center party usually benefits. Although maybe in Canada,
historically, you're correct in Canada as well, sir.
All right then. I think the low turnout is more indicative of the fact that this campaign was just so negative, and it wasn't really based on any sort of issues. The leaders seemed more content to make personal attacks to each other rather than offer any sort of inspiring policy, and that just reflects in the turnout numbers. And that, in addition to all the sort of issues with the polling places, some places I've heard took hours to vote. Even for me, I took 40 minutes to vote, and I made sure to show up early in the morning. And I live in a riding where usually it takes, for me, maybe 10 minutes to vote. I've never really had to wait in a line before. So definitely, I think the Elections Canada played a role in that. COVID played a role in that, since people are probably more hesitant to vote during the fourth wave. But I do think by far the biggest culprit is the fact that the campaign itself and the parties themselves were so uninspiring to vote for. So people just wanted to sit out.
Any quick thoughts as well, Seb?
No, I agree with what Kevin was saying, and especially about the accessibility on the part of Elections Canada. We saw that campuses were prohibited from hosting what they would usually do as special ballot polling stations. You could vote on campus if you lived on residence. That was my understanding, but only for the region in which your university is situated in or your residence is situated in. I think what was also pretty interesting too is that we did see an influx. We saw approximately 900,000 mail-in ballots, and that I think advanced polling was up by 18%, I believe. So very interesting to see that even though advanced polling was up, because of the massive decreases we saw for polling stations on election day, we still see these major lineups that did happen and that could have potentially deterred voters.
Yeah. Switching gears now. I know we've been talking for a little while and we're getting tired. I have a quick trivia-like segment for you guys. So, I don't know if you guys saw the story. I'm hoping not, because it's pretty obscure. But do you guys remember in elementary, middle, high school, how they would have these mock elections where you got to also kind of submit your vote and then it'd tell you who the schools won?
Student votes, yes.
Apparently, there are national numbers for this.
I've seen the numbers, so I'm sorry. I spoil your fun.
Yeah.
Sit quiet.
Okay, but I want you guys to guess the final numbers for each of the parties. Sav and Kevin, I guess, now that Drake has been too informed and written stuff out.
Point of clarification. So,
Sure.
Did the students vote? These are underage students, right? Yeah. Did the students vote for who they wanted to win or who they thought was
who they wanted to win? It's and then those votes would have been pooled as a riding, and it's here's who the students elected in that riding. So Simon will have seat counts.
So you want to see specific seat counts?
I just want for each party, what percentage would you guess they would have won by?
Oh.
Well, they're kids, right? Kids are usually more left wing. I would say the NDP and the Liberals are probably in a dead heat at the very top with like what, like 35, 40% of the vote each. That's my hazardous guess. And the Conservatives, you know, they're probably the party of like the more edgy teenage gamers. Maybe I'll give them 10% of the vote, and then the remainder will split the remaining 10%.
What about the Green Party?
Probably like 4 or 5%. So I guess they overperformed among the youth compared to their actual results.
Sav, what about you? I will tell you, Kevin was a bit off the mark.
Really? Wow.
I was going to be controversial anyways, and I agree with Kevin that I think it was I'm not going to give percentages because I don't do math like that. But I will say I think that the NDP probably would have ranked at number 1. I think the Conservatives might have ranked at number 2. Maybe the Liberals ranked number 3, and then the PPC, because why not? And then I think that it was only a handful of people who had been like, yeah, I like the Green Party because we're all like, my dad likes the Green Party and like my family is very green. Do you know what I mean? So that's how I would kind of rank them.
Okay. Drake, you're laughing because I think you've seen numbers. So
I have. You're not wrong for the Greens.
I will preface by saying that the PPC wasn't in the numbers I got, so I'm suspecting maybe they performed very low, or they just weren't given us an option, which seems not democratic. But regardless, the leading party was the NDP with 27% of the vote.
What?
Yeah.
Okay.
The second place was the Conservative Party with 25% of the vote.
Wow.
That doesn't surprise me.
Third place, the Liberals with 24%. And then the Green Party had 10%. And the Bloc Quebecois had 2%. So I love those people. And then I think the rest was probably undecided or something. Those are numbers I saw, Drake. What were your reactions when you saw those?
I didn't see it in terms of percentage vote breakdown. I saw it in terms of seats. And what I saw was like Liberals formed a minority, again, probably because their student vote is probably just as efficient as their regular vote. It was like Liberals 100 something, NDP just shy of 100. Conservatives, I think, were 70 or 80. Greens had won 3 seats according to the student vote, and I don't remember where the block finished. So that's where I was. You threw me off with vote percentages because I didn't see that.
That's just that I saw. So maybe I'm wrong.
25% for the Conservatives. Wow. Maybe young people aren't as left wing as I thought.
I think what my thinking might be around the Conservative vote, I think when households, particularly conservative households, vote Conservative, it's well known that they vote Conservative. And so I think those sentiments are sort of echoed through their children when they're in high school and middle school. And then whether or not that actually translates into actual votes going forward is interesting to see, but I think that's kind of my thinking behind why the Conservatives ranked high.
Well, I want to wrap this up, so I'm going to give you each 1 minute to answer this. Who won? Who lost?
You decide.
Yes.
All right, starting now. I personally think that the NDP and the Bloc both won. The NDP didn't win from their performance, obviously, but I believe that this balance of power actually favors the NDP. The Liberals can't use the threat of another election to bully the NDP into doing what they want, because the NDP have already seen the results of an election. And now the NDP, I believe, has more leverage because of that over the Liberals to pass more of their progressive agenda. And obviously the Bloc as well, it shored up their support in Quebec. So electorally speaking, they're the biggest winner.
And losers, Kevin?
Losers, I would probably say the Liberals, because they kind of ended up back where they started and their reputation kind of got tarnished, in my opinion, from this election.
Okay, interesting you called the winner the loser, but I expect that to be a sentiment further around this table. Sav, what about you?
Very controversial. I will not do that. I actually think that the winners of this election were the Liberals by the sheer fact that they did win. And not only that they held their own in Ontario, which I found to be quite impressive. We'll see what happens with Atlantic Canada in the next election, and we'll see how Trudeau will answer the question of why did this election ever occur in the next election. But you have to give credit where credit is due in that respect. And then the Bloc maintaining their ground and maintaining that they are still a very serious part of Canadian politics and should not go underestimated. That's for sure. In terms of the losers, I think you have to say the Conservatives, because we saw in the polling prior to this election that we thought there was a serious potential for Conservative government to form government in a minority nonetheless, but still to form government, and they didn't. They were quite stagnant, or Aaron O'Toole's performance was quite stagnant in comparison to Andrew Scheer, and they didn't make the moves that they necessarily wanted to. So we'll see what happens to them. And then I obviously have to say the Greens are in the middle. They won, but they lost.
They won by staying a party, I guess.
They won by the sheer ability that they won 2 seats is remarkable. And I don't think that should go unnoticed, but they definitely lost with a popular vote and their leader, of course.
Okay, Drake, what about you? Winners and losers.
I liked when Lisa Raitt said on CBC last night that this was the $600 million cabinet shuffle. I think at the end of the day, the Bloc is clearly in a strong position, and they've reasserted themselves. Everyone else is pretty much the same position. But at the end of the day, a win is a win, right? And Trudeau is going to have issues. He can't threaten an election straight away. He has to justify this election. But his problems are now very different problems than Aaron O'Toole and Annamie Paul have, and possibly Jagmeet Singh, although I don't think so. They now have to deal with leadership challenges and questions about their future at the helm of their respective parties. I don't think Justin Trudeau is going to face that. He just now has to deal with how does he get on with governing. In terms of losers, it's the Green Party. Mike Morris's win softens that blow, but you have to remember the circumstances, and that in some ways you recognize that if Raj Saini hadn't dropped out of the race, I don't think it would have just been a complete knockout of the Greens, save Elizabeth May as the lone MP once again. And so I think they are the clear loser of this election, if there was one.
I think in some senses we're all the loser of this election, because we're still going to debate about electoral reform for the next 20 days at least, which I hate that debate. But regardless, I wanted to do a segment on electoral reform, and we're running out of time, so now I'm almost going to be tempted to do an episode on it. So rip me when I do that. But I
think that issue deserves an episode.
And I know Drake really wants to be on it, so yeah, okay, I'll probably do one in the near future, but I'll drag myself into it. But yes. Anyways, that almost wraps it up. I have a personal question prepared too, and I'm going to ask you guys, what's your favorite memory of election 2021?
Seeing that CBC report, all those CBC reporters at all the parties and gatherings, and having the CBC reporter at the PPC party being the only one that wore a mask and socially distanced. That was hilarious.
I'm going to say 2. I'll make them really quick. My first one was during the campaign trail where I believe that Jagmeet Singh was out west, and he had 2 Indigenous chiefs with him, and they endorsed the Liberal candidate in that riding right in front of Jagmeet Singh. That was pretty memorable. But I think the second is actually seeing Mike Morris win in Kitchener Centre was probably like a very, very... It was a very good moment to what was a disappointing result for the Green Party.
Drake, I see you're crossing your favorite moment off your list. So
sorry.
I literally wrote down as I was thinking of them. I was going to give quite literally the exact same 2 as Sav. So you've stolen my thunder. I will then come up with a third one and say my third favorite moment would have been Annamie Paul in the English debate inviting the Bloc leader to educate himself on systemic racism, and then just not allowing him to speak and being like, I'm sorry, sir, this is my time, and it's not an insult. It was really well done. And so add that as my third behind the 2 things Sav said.
The moment I'm going to quote the most is Annamie Paul telling her voters to just Google her platform. I'm going to quote so much, but I also really, I guess it's more personal, I guess, but I remember we were watching the French language debate, and I commented halfway through. I was watching with Drake and Yusuf, and I commented halfway through, it'd be so much better if Annamie Paul had released her platform before the debate. And Drake was like, oh, she released it 2.5 days ago. And I am sitting here like, wait, I am doing this podcast. I'm keeping pretty on track of news and platforms. How have I not heard about this? Oh, I have this Green Party friend who's keeping me in contact with everything. She's into campaign. She must have told me about this. And so I messaged Sav immediately, and I'm like, Sav, did the Green Party release their platform? And Sav messages me, no, they didn't, of course. And she had to Google it, and apparently they did. So that was my favorite moment.
I didn't even know. Like, there was no announcement made that the platform had been released, and I was like, what? Yeah. Oh, wait, I'll add one more thing. I think personally what was a disappointing moment was that Jenica Atwin is potentially winning her seat
I think she will, right?
She's flipped that around.
She's up by 500 votes against the Conservative.
Yeah, and there's so many mail-in ballots still to be counted. They probably favored her even more. So
I remember they almost called it last night really early, and we were talking about that. But
and
anyways,
one more favorite moment, Simon. It's been spending all this time with you and our remarkable guests. I say our, it's really your guests, but I guess I'm taking ownership here, Simon. So thank you for your hard work.
We're all friends.
Definitely, Simon.
I don't think
Thank you for doing this.
Beyond knowing me, I don't think any of you had met before this podcast. So I'm honored to bring people together.
Yep.
So yeah. But and I also really want to thank the people listening to this podcast, because they're what gives me the motivation to keep going forward. All of you spent hours, spent some time listening, even if it's only for a few minutes. I really appreciate it. It's, it really, we were in the viewing party the other day, and one of the people there recognized us and like, oh, the podcast people or something. And it was a great feeling. I know Kevin can attest to that as well.
Definitely.
Yeah. I'm glad we're at least sharing perspectives. And if you've learned something, let me know. And if you want to be on an episode, let me know as well. So I guess that kind of wraps it up. Our next episode, I think Drake is going to make me do one on electoral reform. So maybe that'll come out, let's say, in a week or so, if I can drag my feet long enough on that. But we'll see my upload schedule still. I might take a bit slower, considering, I need sleep. Not that I've been too invested, but yeah. No, it's been a great experience, and we'll do a few more episodes, and then I'll maybe plan out what the future's podcast will look like. But yeah, thank you guys for coming on today. I'm hoping you enjoyed the free person format too.
It was good.
Yeah.
Thank you very much again. Sorry, I just want to say thank you very much.
No worries. And yeah, I guess we'll catch you next time. Please like, subscribe, and all that stuff. So yeah, bye everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Sorry, a car passed. I need to close my window real quick. Sorry.
I was wondering what this finger meant.
I was like, 1 second, the car's passing. It's a sign language. I'll ask you in a second, Sav. Sorry.
How unprofessional, leaving his window open.
This is going to be a big edit out.
Every time you see Simon now, you guys have to do this.